It's hard to overstate how important the Switch is for Nintendo. Almost all of its revenue comes from this one product, or the exclusive games the company develops for it. Its popularity since 2017 has driven Nintendo's share price to an all-time high. And everything's riding on the Switch 2, keeping that trend going.
The stakes were very high. People are really expecting the Switch 2 to reinvigorate earnings.
Nintendo is at the most successful point in its history and also one of the riskiest.
And here's why. The Nintendo DS, 154 million sold. The follow-up 3DS, 76 million. The Wii, 102 million sold. The follow-up Wii U, oh dear. And the Nintendo Switch, almost the best-selling console of all time, 152 million sold. No pressure then.
Switch 1 created a very high hurdle for the future consoles to surpass.
So Nintendo's breaking new ground with some very subtle shovels.
It's the first console in Nintendo's history that is kind of the same thing, but just a little bit bigger and a little bit better.
That strategy belies decades of corporate lessons learned sometimes the hardest way. But this time, the stakes are just too high for history to repeat itself. Depending on who you ask, Mario is either Japan's most successfully exported two-dimensional tradesperson or a delusional reckless driver with a princess obsession. Either way, his antics consistently help Nintendo shift hundreds of millions of consoles.
The Switch is soon to be the best-selling console of all time.
It's made over $100 billion in revenue for Nintendo.
In terms of active user base, it is 120 million versus their install base of 140 million.
In other words, 90% of people who own a Switch still use their Switch.
It really captured three things.
You can play on your TV, and then you can pick up and take on the go.
It really had a very compelling price point.
It came in at around $300, which was lower than the PlayStation and Xbox.
Perhaps the biggest reason for the Switch's success, though,
Nintendo combined two different development teams, one of which was focused on console games and one of which was focused on handheld.
So the company has provided the strongest software pipeline ever.
And it's really important for them to have hardware that sells well because all of Nintendo's software can only be played on their hardware.
The Switch 2's got to match or exceed that, and Nintendo's never been averse to risky bets, even when the going's good. Let's go back to 1889. It was an eventful year. Van Gogh painted this. Washington became the 42nd American state, and 29-year-old Fusajiro Yamauchi founded Nintendo here in Kyoto. His business was Hanafuda, or flower cards. Formerly prohibited by Japanese authorities for their association with gambling, a great unclenching of the law in the late 19th century created a legitimate market, and one Nintendo entered. Despite not inventing them, its colourful playing cards bankrolled it for decades. Success with paper-based products could have blinkered its view of electronic opportunities, but Nintendo saw the arcade game frenzy of the 1970s and had the financial footing to do some gambling of its own. The groundbreaking Famicom, later known globally as the Nintendo Entertainment System, propelled the company in the 1980s, much as its handcrafted playing cards had a century earlier. Innovation hasn't always worked out so well, and three missteps in particular taught Nintendo lessons evidently learnt from and applied to the Switch. In the early 90s, the company had a partnership with these guys to create a CD-based game system, but the deal fell apart.
Sony wound up taking that technology and making its own console, the PlayStation, which really started a whole new rival and competitor for Nintendo, and Nintendo wound up losing some of its biggest third-party publishers and partners. Nintendo kind of learned from that by going in its own direction and decided not to adopt CDs for its next console, the Nintendo 64, and stuck with cartridges.
The Switch also uses a form of them, and Nintendo relies on first-party games for the majority of its software revenue. The next lesson was the 3DS. released in 2011, it never lived up to the success of the original DS. Its glasses-free 3D screen was considered gimmicky. Plus, its launch coincided unfavourably with the smartphone revolution buoyed by the iPhone, and free-to-play hits like this ornithological take on controlled building demolition. But a year later, Nintendo would learn its biggest lesson.
Welcome to the world of Wii U.
The Wii U was a new console, a successor to the Wii that used a tablet as the controller.
Which was a complete disaster and really put the company under a lot of strain.
It doesn't have quite the same wow factor as the original Wii did when, you swung something like this around and people went, oh my goodness!
Yeah, well,
what is that?
Completely
this
different.
This is sort of like...
The name of it is very confusing. It kind of seemed like an accessory or a supplement to the Wii rather than a new console.
Which is why we saw this happen.
In many ways, indeed, the failure of the Wii U is what led to the success of the Switch.
It's finally happened. The Nintendo Switch 2 has been unveiled.
This has all led to a view that with the Switch 2, Nintendo's playing it a bit safe, and kind of for the first time.
Alright, so is that it then?
Although it is much more powerful than the Switch, it basically does the same thing.
Honestly, it feels more like a Switch Pro than a true Switch 2.
Some people were disappointed by the lack of innovation there, but from a business perspective, it is exactly what Nintendo needed to do.
You only have to look at where Nintendo sources its revenue. In a typical year, about 93 to 95% of revenue comes from the Switch. They need to show to their investors that they're not just meeting the successes of the Switch, but ideally surpassing that too. Stock is trading just off an all-time high.
It increased more than 20% since the beginning of this year.
And that's because Nintendo is expected to make hit consoles and draw profit almost exclusively from them. From the Super NES in the 90s, to the N64 and GameCube around the millennium, to the Wii, and of course, to the Switch. That's reflected in Nintendo's price-to-earnings ratio, basically a simple way to see how highly investors value a company based on the profit it makes per share.
It's already trading at 40 times PE, which is the highest among the game industry.
In other words, investors are paying a premium over Sony and Microsoft because they expect Nintendo's console to be a hit. So if Nintendo is playing it safe, you now know why. Still, some of Nintendo's biggest threats come from outside the game world.
TikTok and Facebook and Netflix and everybody else out there who is competing for our time.
It is because most of Nintendo's players, they are relatively casual.
Some of the world's biggest tech companies are investing heavily in games as well, and they have the money and customer base to experiment, much like Sony and Microsoft did in the 90s and the 2000s. And then there's the T word.
When Nintendo revealed the details of the Switch 2, just a few hours after that, President Trump came out and launched his press conference on tariffs in the Rose Garden.
Nintendo already had to delay pre-orders briefly to kind of assess the impact of the tariffs, and has not ruled out a price increase for the console.
And that could exacerbate another concern.
It's expensive. It is expensive.
The price point of Switch 2 was definitely a surprise to gamers and investors.
Oh no, this is terrible.
Yeah, it's pretty steep.
Comparing to the previous console, without considering about the FX element, then it will be about 30% increase in the price for all the regions.
I think that Nintendo has to worry a little bit that not only will people pause at spending $450 on a new console, plus however much hundreds of dollars on games and accessories and subscription services for that console, but also that due to the tariffs and other kind of unpredictable forces, they might have to hike the prices.
But Nintendo President Shintaro Furukawa said in May that the relatively high cost of the console would be offset by bundling the new Mario Kart with it, and that future software and experiences will eventually make the Switch 2 what he calls the new standard. Still, there's another lesson Nintendo's set to benefit from having learnt. One also bolstered by Mario and his genetically ambiguous colleagues.
Some people may remember the Super Mario Brothers movie.
They're plumbers.
I think that movie was so scarring for Nintendo that they waited years to release another one.
Saw that in 2023 with the Super Mario Brothers movie. That was a huge success, one of the top grossing movies of the year worldwide. And really that has opened a lot of avenues for Nintendo.
One of the reasons for that is that it was made by people who really had reverence and care for the source material.
Which is accessible, fun, and heavily mustached. In short, Nintendo's in a good place. As long as the world remains excited to race a plumber against a princess and a mushroom.